So there are two communists at work one day, and the one says to the other, how's things going? He says, well, I'm really excited. I'm about to go on vacation. He says, oh, what are you going to do? And he says, well, I am going to go to the beach, and I have a new book with me I'm going to read. And it's just going to be so interesting and exciting, and I'm just going to kind of rest on the beach and read my new book. And so a friend says, oh, what's the new book? He says, well, it's the new government-issued biography of Karl Marx. And he said, I'm going to read this new government-issued biography of Karl Marx. His friend says, well, I just read it. And he said, it's amazing. Wait till you get to the part where he tells the proletariat that they have nothing to lose but their chains and a whole wide world to win, and they should rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish communism around the world. And the other guy turns to him and says, God damn it, spoiler alert, you ruined it for me. Right? And I can tell, and this is not a joke, this anecdote actually happened to me. When I was in college, we had to take a course in liberal arts and sciences. And every student, no matter what your major, biology, chemistry, whatever, you had to take this one course. And we had this little book, and it was full of writings of who they considered to be like great thinkers from around the world. And they had like Immanuel Kant, and they had different philosophers and such. So there was a selection that we had to read in this text, and it was from Karl Marx. But it was an obscure text by Marx. It was from The German Ideology, which is a pamphlet where Karl Marx is arguing in favor of philosophical materialism against the German idealists. Nothing in there about politics. I mean, it's just a really obscure pamphlet. So we had to go read it, and then we had to come back and discuss it. So we go back into class. The professor's like, so, what do you all think of the Karl Marx passage? And this one girl, front row, raises her hand. The part where he says that everyone should get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they worked, I hated that part. And the other guy in the back raises his hand. Yeah, he's like, the part that says that we should have a dictator and we shouldn't have any freedom so that the dictator can make everything equal, I hated that part, And it was pretty clear they hadn't actually read the text, and they were just kind of operating from a stereotype or a widespread conception of what Marxism actually is. But the funny thing is that these widespread conceptions, I would say in a lot of ways, have actually permeated into the Marxist movement. For example, for many years I was involved in a particular revolutionary organization, and as I was finding my way out of that organization and moving out of being a political activist and moving toward being a journalist like I do now, where I just make commentary and educational presentations like this, I remember that one of the people said to me, fine, you can leave now, but someday the workers are going to rise up. They're just going to rise up one day. They won't be able to take it anymore. And where are you going to be when the workers rise up? And I heard that, and I remember thinking, like, this could be like a fundamentalist Christian preacher back in Ohio. Like, sure, you can quit the church now, but when Jesus returns on a shining cloud down from heaven, you're going to feel pretty, that kind of perception about Marxism as just kind of and revolution as just this mystical event that just appears out of nowhere and no one ever sees it coming, and it brings on some glorious utopia. That perception is pretty widespread, and I think even a lot of the people who call themselves Marxists or socialists actually buy into that kind of idea. But the reality is, the Marxist movement does not view revolution in that way. If you learn anything from the study of Marxism, it's that revolutions are not mythic, magical events that come out of nowhere. They're not spontaneous. They're not randomly occurring, and they are not explosions of rage and passion. And these vague notions of revolution that we see in Hollywood movies like Les Miserables and stuff, that's been around long before Karl Marx was ever born. William Blake, the famous English poet, his very famous poem Jerusalem said, "Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariots of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." And that was William Blake, and he wrote that in 1808, 10 years before Karl Marx was actually born. This kind of revolutionary, mystical, magical notion was around. But what distinguished Karl Marx and his theories was his ability to talk about concepts like socialism, class struggle, and revolution in a scientific way. And in order to explain the actual nature of revolution, which is the theme of this class, I will be drawing from Marxism and historical and dialectical materialism. Now, the word revolution itself comes from Latin, and its literal word meaning, it's the word revolutio in Latin, it means to turn around. And the first time the word revolution was ever applied in politics was in the year of 1450. Around the time of 1450 in England, Documents began to refer to big turnarounds and big changes in politics as if they were revolutions. However, the way the word revolution really caught on was in 1543 when Copernicus composed his groundbreaking book on the revolution of heavenly spheres. Now, this book was not about politics, it was about astronomy. It argued that the sun, not the earth, was at the center of the universe. And the book was not about politics. Copernicus' book had nothing to do with politics. It was purely about astronomy. But it had huge political implications. It argued that what Copernicus had discovered by means of mathematics and his use of a primitive telescope was true, and that what was said by the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, saying that the earth was the center of the universe, was false. That was big. That was a huge political statement, even though the book was purely about astronomy. Now, followers of Copernicus, who believed that the earth was revolving and challenged the teachings of the Catholic hierarchy, began referring to themselves as revolutionaries. And the leaders of the French Revolution in 1789 opposed the Catholic Church, seeing it as a corrupt institution that granted legitimacy to a tyrannical king and aristocracy. And those who led the charge to bring down the King of France called themselves revolutionaries because they rejected Catholic teachings, and also because they engaged in a big political turnaround, and essentially the two terms were combined. You had the combination of the astronomical term of revolution and the political definition, and it came together in this notion of a revolution as people going out and overturning the old order and trying to replace it with something better and more scientific. That's really where it came into being. And Marxism and scientific socialism, as they emerged, they came to understand the concept of revolution as human beings advancing to higher stages of civilization. This view fits in with historical materialism, which understands that the history of human beings is a constant struggle to improve living conditions and create a higher level of abundance and stability. Frederick Engels wrote, "The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. But man, by his changes, makes the environment serve his ends and masters it. And this is the final and essential distinction between man and other animals, that human beings have the ability to force the environment to serve them, to create, to be creative and intelligent." And when human civilization is prepared for a great advance, it comes in three stages. First, there is an economic revolution, and advances in technology make the old system of production and economics unsustainable. Then there's a social revolution, in which a new class emerges to fit this new advance in technology. And then third, there's a political revolution, when this new class becomes the ruling class and takes control of society and the government. And for the majority of human history, as folks know, we were hunter-gatherers. We were, hunting wild animals, we were gathering fruits and nuts, and that's how we survived. But eventually, with our brilliance and our creativity as human beings, we got too good at hunting and gathering. We developed, spears and rocks to kill animals with. We began tracking the patterns and how plants grew, so we knew how to hunt and gather, and there was a big scarcity, right? So an economic revolution took place that made it so that hunting and gathering was no longer a sustainable way of living. And so, after that economic revolution, you had the first social revolution, which is when people began growing their own food and domesticating animals. And you had the dawn of agriculture, and you had a class of landowners, of people who claimed a little piece of land and claimed some animals and said it belonged to them, the origin of private property. And then you had the first political revolution to follow up that social revolution, which was the birth of ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Or you can fast forward to the 1400s in Europe. We had new technological innovations like the printing press, textile looms. All of this made feudalism unsustainable. During the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, we saw an economic revolution, with new technology laying the basis for the elimination of the feudal system. So another social revolution took place with the rise of the merchants, a new class. Merchants and the traders, they sold goods for a living, they traveled around. They were neither peasants who worked the land or landowners and nobles. They were a new class. And ultimately, the political revolutions shook Europe and France, England, and Germany, and elsewhere, as the nobles and kings were toppled and replaced by the merchants and bankers, this new class that took power. And eventually the merchants and bankers set up factories and became the capitalists and industrialists who rule the world today. It is with the emergence of capitalism that we got the modern political system of liberal democracy and nation states. Revolutions have three phases: first economic, then social, then political. Now, the Communist Manifesto was written and published in the year of 1848. And that was the year of what people called the Spring of Nations, because every European country, except for Britain and Russia, had a massive uprising or revolt in that year. In these revolts, you saw liberals, nationalists, and radicals joining forces under the banner of republicanism and demanding the creation of modern democratic states, or republics. And Karl Marx's Communist League was a grouping among the radical Republicans in Germany who wanted universal male suffrage, which back then was a big demand. To have the right of every man to vote was big, and not having just property owners voting. And they also called for the creation of socialism. The revolutions of 1848, they ultimately failed, and it's actually as a result of the failure of the revolution in Germany in 1848 that millions of Germans fled to the United States. That's why today, you know, the most common last name in the United States is Miller, which is from the German Müller. It's because thousands and millions of Germans fled here to escape the failed revolution. And interestingly, the first Marxists in the United States were people who had fled Germany in the aftermath of this revolution. Joseph Wedemeyer and August Willich were two Marxists who fled to the United States, and both of them became prominent leaders of the Civil War. Joseph Wedemeyer, he led the Ohio 9th Regiment, which was considered to be the Red or Communist division of the Union Army that carried the red flag as its marching emblem during the Civil War. And August Willich became a brigadier general in the Union Army. Both of them corresponded with Karl Marx throughout the Civil War. And Marx was actually employed by the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party newspaper here in New York City. So I think it's very funny nowadays. A lot of times the Republicans are always accusing people they don't like of being communists. Well, actually, originally, if you go way back, in the early days of the Republican Party, the communists were Republicans. I think that's pretty funny. So Marxists generally argue that revolutions require a revolutionary situation. And Lenin described a revolutionary situation this way. And I'm going to read the quote, and then we can break for our discussion, because that'll be the first part. So I'll just read you the quote where Lenin describes a revolutionary situation. He says, "What, generally speaking, are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? We shall certainly not be mistaken if we indicate the following three as the major symptoms. 1. When it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change, when there is a crisis in one form or another among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes bursts forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live the old way. It is necessary that the upper classes should also be unable to live in the old way. 2. When the suffering in one of the oppressed classes has grown more acute than usual. And 3. When, as a consequence of the above causes, there is considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who unaccompaniedly allow themselves to be robbed during peace times, but in turbulent times, are drawn both by the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Without these objective changes, which are independent of the will, not only of individual groups and parties, but even of individual classes, a revolution as a general rule is impossible. The totality of all these objective changes is what you can call a revolutionary situation." So that's where we'll end the first part.
Just a quick tidbit on socialism. What I'm concerned about is that there's still going to be a ruling class regardless. Bernie Sanders in 2016 said millionaires and billionaires, and now he's only saying billionaires because now he's a millionaire himself. So what I'm concerned about
is that true?
I noticed that, yeah. So what I'm concerned about is how can you still trust the ruling class to make it work for the proletariats, for the working people that could end up getting the same amount of pay regardless of how much work they end up doing.
I think the thing is that Marx didn't, I'll answer that question. Marx didn't define the ruling class by their income level. He defined it by their relationship to the means of production. Right? And those who work for a living and sell their labor power are workers, and those who own for a living and own major centers of economic power and live by owning, by making profits from what they own, those are capitalists, and that's the ruling class. And the idea of socialism is to put society in control of the means of production. So they're no longer functioning just to make a profit for their owners, but they're functioning according to a central plan. And that way they can operate for the good of all society. I mean, that's generally the Marxist definition. And that's why it gets so confusing when there's a lot of talk about income inequality, and like I learned in school that communism is everyone getting paid the same wage, and you know, that's why there's so much confusion there. But ultimately, Socialism is when society takes control of the major centers of economic power and operates them in a rational way, not according to the anarchy of production or the chaos of the market. And then communism is the ultimate vision, that Marx put forward. He argued that eventually, thousands of years in the future, there would be so much material abundance that would be developed, and so the production would have become so efficient that the need for any state would fade away, and that people would be able to just kind of take what they need and do what they want. But this is like an ideal. This is something to be strived for, right? And that's the ultimate of the Marxist vision, but the way to achieve it was by rationally controlling the means of production. And that's what Marx wrote about. And interestingly, Marxism is very strongly rooted in this vision of historical progress, the idea that we are advancing, right? And that we advanced from hunter-gatherer civilization, to feudalism and slavery, and now to capitalism, and that socialism is the next stage, and then socialism will eventually give way to communism, the higher stage. That's the Marxist narrative. It's interesting because you don't hear that. And that's why many people would argue that even though Bernie Sanders talks about socialism, he's ultimately not a socialist, because he doesn't advocate the means of production being held in public hands. He simply advocates capitalism with a bigger welfare state. He advocates more social programs, free healthcare, free college, taxing the rich to pay for it. But ultimately, socialism is a new economic order in which the economy is planned and not operating for profits. So,
I notice in poorer countries, people have more children because the children could be considered free labor to run their farms and such like that. But in the developed countries, we don't need like child labor for a lot of things, so we tend to have less kids. And I feel like we have to develop poorer countries to not have so many kids, to not contribute to overpopulation, and help them technology-wise to adapt as well instead.
Well, there's a couple of different reasons for the large populations and large numbers of child births in underdeveloped countries. So one of them is the idea that you can have labor, but a lot of it comes down to infant mortality rates, especially when you're talking about places like the Caribbean and sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of it also comes down to malnutrition and infant mortality. So oftentimes people will have more kids just to have more children survive to adulthood. And then there's also this extra added layer of, in a lot of these societies, being religious and having that element of a lack of either birth control or like a lack of family planning, which contributes even further to the idea of having children. So like the notion of larger families in underdeveloped countries is often more complex than having just free labor with their children.
I mean, I, for one, think that I would reject the concept of overpopulation. I think it's not a question of overpopulation, it's just that we need a more efficient way of operating. We need higher forms of energy and resources, and that this idea of overpopulation, that's exactly what the feudal ruling class said when their system was under attack, right? When, in fact, Malthus, the man who coined the term overpopulation, was around at the time he was in England, at the time that the French Revolution happened, and he said, oh my gosh, there's just, there's too many poor people, right? And the population has outstripped the food supply, and there's just too many people. Right? And at that point, the human population was so much smaller than it is today. And the ruling classes generally, when there's upheavals and protests and strikes, they generally respond by saying, oh, there's just too many of those poor people. They're breeding too much. And that notion, I believe, is fundamentally poisonous. I think we should be developing more technology, rationally operating the economy to support more people. I think that ultimately, and that the concept of overpopulation is rooted fundamentally in the kind of the ruling class not understanding that their system doesn't work. I mean, that's been my understanding of it. But I know there's different views in the room. So do we want to go on to the next section? Or, oh, okay.
The last quote you read, was that, who was it? Was that Lenin or Marx? Lenin? Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that because the part where it talks about how for there to be revolution, there's multiple forces that are necessary. Not only the majority of the population, the working class or peasantry, to be basically fed up with the old system, but actually the second part of that we don't hear enough, and a lot of the left and communists and socialists and other leftists never really talk about the other aspect of what he says there, which is the aspect of that a section of the ruling class itself needs to be basically fed up with the old system. And I think that goes into what you've talked about a lot with the aspect of Bonapartism.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I guess we'll then begin the next section, section 2, which is a case study of the Russian Revolution. So the Russian Revolution of 1917 did not happen randomly. A huge number of factors were involved. Unlike Western Europe, Russia had remained a largely agrarian and semi-feudal economy. And among the wealthy intellectuals and students in Russia, you had a long-standing revolutionary intelligentsia that had formed and sought to modernize the country, overthrow the Tsar, and create some kind of either democratic or ultimately socialist government. And among the Russian revolutionaries, the first group that came into existence was called the Narodniks, and it means peopleists, but I mean it's often translated as populist, but that's not accurate. We understand populism differently than that, but it's the Narodniks. And the Narodniks were Russian students, intellectuals, who thought that the peasantry would be the basis of the revolution. They were known for going out among the peasantry. In some cases, they would dress like the peasantry to look as if they were peasants, and they would go to the peasants and try to incite them to rise up against their landlords. And actually, in some cases, the Narodniks started building communes. They would buy pieces of land and start running like cooperative farming and things like that. And actually, probably one of the most well-known intellectuals among the Narodniks was an anarchist named Peter Kropotkin. And he was kind of the intellectual of the Narodniks. And then there was a political party that was formed to follow the Narodnik ideology, and that was the Social Revolutionary Party. And they existed, and they believed that the peasantry in Russia would be the basis of the revolution, and the revolution would come about with the peasants taking control of the land, holding it in common, and having collective farming. That was the Narodniks. Now, in addition to the Narodniks, after that you had the emergence of another grouping that saw what the Narodniks were doing and said, look, the peasants aren't rising up, they're not revolting, we dress like them, we talk like them, but they don't want to revolt. So you had another grouping that emerged, and they were called the terrorists. And that was actually their name, by the way, that wasn't a slur on them, they actually called themselves the terrorists. And their idea was that instead of trying to go to the peasants and convince them to rise up against landlords and build communes, that what they would do is they would engage in acts of violence. For example, Tsar Alexander III was killed by a terrorist. The terrorist threw bombs at his carriage, killed him. The terrorists engaged in acts of violence, bombing, and assassinations. And the idea was that that would inspire the people to rise up. They would engage in terror, acts of terror, and the people would see these acts of terror and they would be inspired, and then they would rise up. It was to incite the masses. They would engage in acts of terror. And it was Marxism that emerged among the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. It was really the third ideological development. And Marxism came to Russia. It had been in Western Europe and France and Germany, and it came to Russia pretty late. And the difference that the Marxists had with the terrorists and with the Narodniks was that they didn't believe that it was the peasants that would make the revolution. They also didn't believe that acts of terrorism and violence would make the revolution. They argued that it was the factory workers and the industrial working class. In the Russian urban areas, you started to have the steel mills that were emerging and other factories, that they would be the ones to make the revolution. And they formed the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was part of the Second International. Marx had started the First International, and eventually it collapsed. And then there was the Second International, which was mainly centered around Germany and the German Social Democratic Party. And it was the world Marxist movement, like the Socialist Party of the United States was part of it. The British Labour Party eventually became part of it. It was the Second International. And the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was the Second International affiliate, the Marxist Party of Russia. And they existed, and they were very much a loose political association. To join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, you just had to say you agreed with some basic principles, pay your dues, and sign, and you were a member. And in 1903, Lenin argued that they needed a party of a new type, that the way that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was operating as this kind of loose association, that this was not sufficient, that in order to make a revolution they needed what he called a party of a new type. And the very famous pamphlet that Lenin wrote, which is often quoted, called What Is to Be Done, was him arguing for the creation of this party of a new type. Lenin was basically arguing in his pamphlet, What Is to Be Done, that they needed a highly disciplined organization of people who gave, quote, the whole of their lives to the revolutionary movement. And many people look at this and they see this as kind of the distinction between the liberal revolutionary sentiments of Western Europe and the Eurasian traditions of Russia, right? Russia has a whole history of revolutionary secret societies and orders. They were like the Decembrists that were very famous. So they tried to bring down Tsar Nicholas I. You also have what was called the Old Believers. When the Russian Orthodox Church changed its rules and dropped a lot of its old rules, there's a group called the Old Believers. It formed a secret society with secret signs and kept the old teachings. And there's a long tradition of secret societies and revolutionary conspiracies in Russia. So in a lot of ways, you could argue that Lenin, with his party of a new type, was adapting Marxism to Russia's culture and Russia's traditions. And he argues in his pamphlet, What is to be Done, that essentially the party of a new type would engage in what he called propaganda and agitation. That first they would engage in agitation. Whenever there was an uprising among the people, or there was a strike among factory workers or a protest, the party would go there and it would agitate, and it would make it bigger. It would blow it up into a bigger uprising and have it expand. They would agitate by stirring people up to revolt against their conditions. But they would also engage in propaganda, which was the opposite. Agitation was just stirring people up to go out and fight against the old order, but propaganda was teaching people Marxism, right? And so they would agitate to the masses, and they would propagate to the advance. They would find people who were smart enough to become communists, willing to become, and they would propagate to them and teach them Marxism. So it would engage in agitation and propaganda. They would build this party of a new type, and they would form what was called a central committee. And so Lenin basically approached all the prominent intellectuals and leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and asked them to join his central committee. It was like all of these leaders that we know about now, like Bukharin, Zinoviev, Stalin, all of them were very well respected. They were known for their writings, they were known for leading protests and strikes. And in order to hold the group together, Lenin came up with what he called democratic centralism, which was this idea that first they would have debate and discussion about what the right thing to do was, and after they made a decision, they would all be obligated to carry it out, right? So it would be broad discussion and debate, but then unity and action. If they ultimately took a vote and they decided we were going to do the opposite of what you wanted, you were obligated to keep doing what the group decided to do. It was democratic and centralist. And that was the way that Lenin got all these very, very well-known, sophisticated intellectuals to be in the same group. And another aspect of what he called democratic centralism was this idea that the party would have a united face to the masses. The disagreements within the party would only be inside the party. But when they approached the masses, they would all say the same thing. The disagreements were internal, and to the masses they had a unified face. And that was what was called democratic centralism. And so, Lenin convened this meeting in exile. I believe it was in London. He gathered all these Bolshevik, or all these prominent leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Party, Labor Party together and pitched this idea to form a central committee for his party of a new type. And the majority of the people in the meeting agreed to follow Lenin, and the minority did not. And so the majority, they became the Bolsheviks, that's what Bolshevik literally means. It means majority. And so they started calling themselves the Bolsheviks, or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parenthesis, Bolsheviks. And those who didn't agree with it and wanted to keep with the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party's old way of doing things, they were called the Mensheviks, or the minority. So they were the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parentheses, Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks, they had a theoretical newspaper called Iskra, and that was where they laid out their Marxist ideas. That was their propaganda journal that explained their Marxist and communist philosophy. But then they had a daily newspaper that was their agitational newspaper, and it was called the Pravda. That means truth in Russian. And the editor of the Iskra, I believe, was Lenin. He was the editor of the Iskra. And the editor of Pravda was Stalin. And Pravda did not have Marxist ideas in it. It simply had stirring people up and encouraging them to go out and struggle. And actually, Pravda was known for anonymous letters. And they would print anonymous letters by workers about their factory, right? If their boss was treating them very badly, they would write an anonymous letter. Other people would read it. They would write in and say, yeah, my boss is doing the same thing. And it was a way of spreading the grievances of Russian workers and kind of making them well known. That was the Pravda. And then you had Iskra, where they were writing out their theoretical perspectives. Lenin eventually developed this thesis about capitalism had become imperialism, which was its highest stage. He argued that it was important for communists to support nationalism, even though Karl Marx had rejected nationalism. That was all being done in Iskra, and Pravda was the agitational paper. So that was 1903 when the Bolsheviks were formed. And then in 1905, you had Russia's first revolution, the 1905 revolution. And the way the 1905 revolution had begun, it was basically, as conditions were getting worse and Russia was facing kind of an economic crisis, people were getting poorer, wages were going down, conditions in the factories were getting worse, you had this priest named Father Gapon. And he was actually a police agent. He worked for the Tsar's police, but he was a well-known priest. And he was organizing the low-income and poor workers to have a march to the Tsar's palace to beg the Tsar to give more food to the poor people, right? And it was a very religious march. It was asking the Tsar, on a kind of a religious, basis, can you please feed the poor? It was not a militant rally or demonstration, and Father Gapon was in touch with the Tsar's secret police the whole time as he was organizing it. At the same time, the Bolsheviks realized that Father Gapon had a big following. So on the day that Father Gapon called his big demonstration, January 22nd, 1905, the Bolsheviks had all of the unions that they were affiliated with go on strike. And so there was a strike all across St. Petersburg, and then Father Gapon had his peaceful march to the Tsar's palace, demanding, not even demanding, just begging the Tsar, can you please feed your hungry people? Lo and behold, the peaceful demonstration was fired on by the military. They opened fire on it. At least probably about 200 or more people were killed. In response to that, there were uprisings all across the country. In the Navy, in the Tsar's Navy, sailors killed their officers and refused to obey, and there were strikes. And in St. Petersburg, they created a Soviet, which was a workers' council. They elected Leon Trotsky to be the leader of it. And it was temporary, and it was ultimately crushed. But it was what people called the dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution. It was this episode of 1905. And that the Bolsheviks, they operated within this 1905 revolution. They had been part of it, they were organizing it, they were agitating and propagating, and they were engaging in it. And they argued that this was how the Bolsheviks learned to organize what eventually came later in the revolution of 1917. So fast forward to 1917. Russia was involved in World War I. Millions of Russian young men were on the front lines fighting against the Germans in World War I. And Tsar Nicholas II was on the throne, and he was viewed as largely incompetent. He was losing the war, and he was also kind of the laughingstock of Europe, because he had come under the influence of this guy named Rasputin, who was like a magician or something, and he thought this guy had magical powers, and all of Europe was really laughing at the Tsar and how he was under the influence of this guy Rasputin, who was like a con man and a magician. And ultimately, it was other nobles who were so embarrassed that assassinated Rasputin in hopes of saving Russia's reputation. They were losing the war. So in February of 1917, and that's according to the Russian calendar, there was a strike by Bolshevik workers. They went on strike demanding, down with the Tsar, right? And usually when there was a strike, the police would rush in and just arrest everybody, and that was it. But this time, the police went in to arrest them, but then the Cossacks, which were like the cavalry, the mounted horsemen, they went in and protected the strikers. And in doing that, they sent out the message to all the workers across St. Petersburg that the military of Russia, the Cossacks, the mounted cavalry, they basically approve of you going on strike. So all over St. Petersburg and in other cities, everyone went on strike, demanding down with the Tsar and wanting a democratic government. And so the Tsar stepped down. At that point, it was pretty much a consensus, even among the richest people in Russia, that they wanted to get rid of the Tsar. The Tsar was incompetent, he was losing the war, they needed to get rid of him. But during the toppling of the Tsar, these Soviets, or these councils, they emerged once again to be the centers that the Bolsheviks were using to organize the people to resist the Tsar and to fight for their interests. So in the aftermath, you had Kerensky was appointed, and they started what they called the provisional government. The idea was eventually they'd have a constituent assembly, and it would be this new government that would be just kind of a regular capitalist democratic government. But there was a big division among the Russian capitalists at the time, among the wealthy people in Russia, because some of them were financially tied in with the wealthy corporations and banks of the United States and Britain. And they wanted to continue fighting in World War I and be an ally of the Americans and the British. But there were a large number of Russian capitalists that were tied in with the Germans. And they wanted to end World War I and stop fighting the Germans because they were tied in economically with the Germans. So there's this big division, right? Should we continue the war or should we not continue the war? So Lenin came back from exile, and he basically, that's where you get the peace, land, and bread, the slogan that we all know made the Russian Revolution. And the Bolsheviks were basically known as the anti-war guys. It was, if you're with the Bolsheviks, end the war. We want to end the war. I mean, it was peace, land, and bread, but peace was the main one. We are the party that wants to end the war. That was basically the message of the Bolsheviks. So as the year of 1917 is going on, you have the July days, there's a whole lot of strikes and uprisings demanding an end to the war. So then, among the military, you had this individual named Kornilov. And Kornilov was a general in the military. He wanted to continue fighting World War I. And he basically announced that he was going to overthrow Kerensky. And he was going to establish a military dictatorship, and that would continue World War I. And he was basically going to kill all the people that were opposing World War I, all the wealthy corporations and bankers that were tied to the Germans and all that. If Kornilov came into power, they were done. They were finished. So it was announced that Kornilov was going to take his army and march it to St. Petersburg, and he was going to declare himself to be the military dictator. And this army was coming. So the Bolsheviks, who were in St. Petersburg, started organizing all the people in St. Petersburg to build barricades and to get guns and to start protecting St. Petersburg from Kornilov, who was coming to take over and establish his military dictatorship. And it got to the point, the provisional government was so weak, they started opening up armories and handing the guns over to the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were the ones organizing this military defense of St. Petersburg against Kornilov. And it got to the point that the Bolsheviks' army was actually bigger than the army of the provisional government. So as Kornilov was marching, they got word that the city was so well fortified and the Bolsheviks had built such a big, effective army to beat back Kornilov that Kornilov turned around. Right? And he, in September of 1917, Kornilov turned around and he didn't attack St. Petersburg, didn't come in and declare himself a military dictator. And then, October, a couple months later, the Bolsheviks realized they were strong enough, they just seized power. And they took over the telegraph offices and they took over the Winter Palace and they announced that the Soviet, or the council that they had built during the revolution, that this Soviet was the new government. It became Soviet Russia. A couple years later, you had the Soviet Union. That's how the Russian Revolution happened. Not a lot is written about it. People often think of it in a very romantic way, but it was a series of long alliances that ultimately made it. And I wanted to just end, I don't want to get into too much about the Soviet Union here, but Lenin very famously said that socialism, that his definition of socialism was, he said it was Soviet power plus electrification, right? That these councils that they had organized, these Soviets, if they could control electrification, which was cutting-edge technology, and bring power and electricity to the whole country, and bring running water to the whole country, and make Russia into an industrial power on the basis of these Soviets. That's what socialism was. And Stalin is the one who ultimately carried that out with his 5-year plans. And the whole world watched as Russia went from being an agrarian, impoverished country to being a global superpower. The biggest hydroelectric power plants in the world. The biggest steel manufacturing apparatus in the world. They were the first country. Later, they eventually became the first country in outer space. So that all took place. That vision of Soviet power plus electrification was ultimately brought into being. And the Soviet Union had huge achievements in industrializing the country, despite the fact that they were constantly under attack. I mean, they were constantly surrounded. They had the Nazi invasion that killed at least 20 million people. But it was Soviet power plus electrification, and that's what made modern Russia what it is today. If Russia had remained a capitalist country, it would have stayed an agrarian, impoverished country. But they were able to industrialize it and all that with central planning and socialism. So that's section 2 on case study of the Russian Revolution. So do we want to discuss that?
Iskra is the Slavic word for spark or ember.
Cool.
I'll just say I was very interested because I didn't know too much about the origin of the word Soviet, so I just found that part very interesting. Because my knowledge of the Russian Revolution actually wasn't again, like what you talk about, where it's not like too much is written about it per se. It's more just romanticized or like briefly glossed over in history books. So I thought, nowhere had I ever seen at least the origin of where the word Soviet came from.
One thing that's very clear is that there were multiple stages of the revolution, different forces involved, varying levels of, you could say, radical vision of what they wanted to implement. But what basically led to the most radical revolution that eventually led to the implementation of socialism in the country, in the first, I guess basically the first socialist state in the world, was a response and a defensive measure against an aggressive action by reactionary forces within the country. And I think a lot of times that's not really, like we talked about, the romanticization of the Russian Revolution as well as many revolutions. And most of the time when these sorts of things happen, there's many factors at play, many different players, and what pushes it forward to the most idealistic or revolutionary aspect is often it's not like people going out and deciding, okay, we're gonna just overthrow everything just for the sake of overthrowing everything. It's often a response to violence against them or violence that's possibly going to take place.
All right, so section 3 is another case study. This one is of the Bolivarian Revolution. So this is in South America. Now, in response to the fall of the Soviet Union, huge changes took place throughout South and Central America. The first big change is that economic neoliberalism, which is a drastic reduction in social programs and the role of the government in the economy, escalated. What had already started in Pinochet's Chile and somewhat in Argentina during the 1980s spread throughout the entire continent. In Bolivia, the oil and actually the water of Bolivia was sold off to American corporations. So it was actually a crime in Bolivia if you collected water on your roof. They were stealing from like Nestle or Coca-Cola, like American companies. In Venezuela, most of the revenue from the state-run oil companies stopped actually going into the public budget. It basically just went to American corporations. They were getting all the profits from Venezuela's supposedly nationalized oil company. And as a result of that, garbage collection kind of stopped in a lot of areas. You couldn't get your garbage collected. The electricity in a lot of neighborhoods would just go off for weeks because the government didn't have enough of a budget to actually pay to keep the electricity on. And that all over South and Central America, you got these really free market extreme policies that were being implemented. And very famously, Milton Friedman of the Chicago School of Economics, who was the one who was associated with these policies, he famously said that his enemy in Latin America was not Karl Marx, it was Juan Perón. And he was referring to the fact that there were these large kind of social democratic welfare states that were aligned with the United States that were not communist that had sprung up during the Cold War. And he wanted to get rid of that. He wanted all the countries of South and Central America to be completely unregulated free market countries, and that it was no longer necessary to allow these countries to develop more social democratic systems. That was the first big change that happened in Latin America after the fall of the Soviet Union. The second, though, is that the military juntas and the Bonapartist dictatorships that had sprung up during the Cold War, they started to loosen up because there was no threat of communist revolution. So, this idea that you needed to have an absolute military rule, that started to fade away. And that there were a lot of sections of the ruling classes of these countries that did want things to be more loose. And so the communists had been protesting for democracy and for free speech and things like that. All of a sudden, throughout South and Central America, they had a lot of allies among the richest people in countries like Chile and Argentina and Colombia, for example. All of a sudden, they had a lot of allies who wanted to have a more liberal democratic model and not have an absolute military dictatorship because there was no need for it, because there was no danger of communist revolutions happening. So at the same time you have economic neoliberalism spreading through South and Central America, you also have the free elections taking place. And suddenly, it used to be, there were times in these countries where if you so much as said that you were a communist or were caught with a communist leaflet, you could be killed. Well, now, suddenly they're having free speech and they're having free elections. So, based on that, the communists of South and Central America drastically reoriented their tactics, right? During the 1970s and 80s, Cuba and other socialist countries and various communist parties throughout South and Central America had been pushing for guerrilla warfare. They had the Tricontinental Congress that was in Cuba, and you had the FARC in Colombia, you had various armed groups throughout South and Central America that were encouraging people to take up guns and try and wage some kind of rural people's war or Che Guevara-ness kind of thing. Well, now, as these countries were moving toward more of a liberal democratic state, and at the same time that economic neoliberalism was devastating the urban areas, instead of being in the countryside and trying to organize some kind of armed uprising in the countryside, the communists started operating in the urban areas and building united fronts against neoliberalism and cuts in social spending. For example, I went to one neighborhood in Caracas in Venezuela, and they talked about how in the 1990s the electricity wouldn't come on for weeks. So the local church and the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party and local people that weren't involved in any party, they organized a strike. So everyone in the neighborhood didn't go to work until the power came back on. It was understood that everyone who lives in this area, they're not going to go to work until the power comes back on. And lo and behold, the government had to then turn the power back on. They talked at one point, the garbage wasn't being collected in this particular neighborhood. So the Communist Party started collecting all the garbage, and they took it and they dumped it on a major highway, and they poured gasoline on it, and they lit it on fire. And so, lo and behold, the government started collecting the garbage. And basically the idea was to build a coalition against neoliberalism and against the IMF and the World Bank, which were loaning money to these developing countries and then mandating that they completely gut their public sector, right? They basically polarized these countries between, are you for neoliberalism and the cuts in social spending, or are you against it? And there were a lot of very wealthy people in Latin America that were against it, right? Because it was devastating the local economies. A lot of the people that had big corporations in Venezuela, for example, they were being put out of business by American corporations that were just coming in there, and they wanted the Venezuelan government to protect them. They had an incident in Venezuela called the Caracazo, and that was after there had been cuts in government funding for public transportation. They were forced to raise the costs of public transportation drastically. The people went out and rioted and rebelled against it. It was after that you had a Venezuelan political figure known as Hugo Chavez who attempted to carry out a military coup and overthrow the government in response to these cuts in social services. Now it failed, he was then thrown into prison. And Hugo Chavez, interestingly, did not call himself a socialist at that point. He said he was against both capitalism and socialism. He was for what he called the third way, which would be the government doing whatever was best for Venezuela. It would be neither capitalist or socialist. He went to prison in 1992, got out of prison, and announced that he would never try to overthrow the government again, never engage in violence, but instead he would build a political party. And so they built a new political party called the Movement for a Fifth Republic. And it was a very popular political party, again, not advocating socialism, advocating the third way, what was best for Venezuela. He got elected. He won the election in 1998, took office in 1999. Shortly after Hugo Chavez was elected, there was huge mudslides in the country, and a lot of homes were destroyed. And so Chavez, being a former leader of the military, he got on television, and he said that he was sending the military to help the people who'd been afflicted by these mudslides. And then he called on people all throughout the country to be patriotic and to do everything they can to pull together to help their brothers and sisters who'd had their homes destroyed by these mudslides. And doing that had never been done in Venezuela's history. The military had never been mobilized to go and rescue people whose homes had been destroyed by a natural disaster. And a lot of people really responded to this and were deeply moved to have the president of their country encouraging them to go out and volunteer and help people. You can remember a couple of years later, after 9/11, George W. Bush got on TV and said, if you want to help the victims of terrorism, go shopping. Well, Chavez wasn't telling people to go shopping. In fact, he had them organize these things called Bolivarian circles in their neighborhood, where they would coordinate volunteers to go into the area. And the whole country just got kind of worked up into this fit of patriotism, and they just loved what Chavez was doing. And so then, in the aftermath of this mudslides incident, Chavez got the country to ratify his new constitution. And Venezuela changed its name to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. It was the fifth republic in Venezuela. A new constitution was created. He actually had a TV program called Hello President, where he got on TV every Sunday and he took calls from average citizens. He answered their questions. And lo and behold, he became very popular. After 9/11, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, he showed pictures on his television program of innocent children who'd been killed by the bombs in Afghanistan. He said, obviously 9/11 was a horrendous crime, but it doesn't justify the killing of these children in Afghanistan. What George Bush is doing, invading Afghanistan, it was actually the Saudis who did 9/11, this is wrong. Shortly after that, Chavez then appointed a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet. Because the communists had been so key in getting Chavez elected, he appointed one of them to be in his cabinet. So then in 2002, there was an attempted military coup against Hugo Chavez, and the rank-and-file soldiers rose up and put Hugo Chavez back into power. And shortly afterwards, 2003, Chavez announced that the country was moving toward what he called 21st Century Socialism. And they became a lot closer with Cuba. Chavez changed the nature of the state-run oil company so that all the profits from Venezuela's oil would go into the public budget. He then started using the money from the public budget, from this oil that was being sold, to build free healthcare clinics. Brought in Cuban doctors that would give free healthcare clinics to people in low-income areas. He also brought in Cuban literacy teachers and he ultimately wiped out illiteracy in the country. In 1998, when Chavez was elected, Venezuela at that point only had 12 public universities. Today it has 32. He used the oil money to build these public universities. He also started funding small businesses and enabling people in Venezuela to start their own businesses. And he built these things called colectivos or communes, which are kind of cooperatives and areas where people kind of held things in common and lived. And shortly after that, you had Bolivia taking a very similar transformation. In Bolivia, there had been a wave of protests and strikes by miners. There had been a mass movement calling for the natural gas to be nationalized and the profits from the natural gas to go into the public budget. And just as the election of Chavez in 1998 was a referendum on neoliberalism, the election of Evo Morales, that was also considered to be a referendum on neoliberalism. And he also passed a new constitution in 2008. The Morales government built a massive amount of roads throughout the country. In Bolivia, there's a lot of sections of the country that had no roads. So he, used the public budget to start building roads. They brought electricity to parts of the country that had never had it before, and they started providing assistance to small farmers. They regulated the price of food and fuel, and poverty has been greatly reduced. They nationalized the oil and natural gas, and it's interesting to note, Venezuela has been having quite a few problems lately. But actually, the highest rate of gross domestic product growth in South America in 2018 was in Bolivia. It was the Evo Morales government has actually presided over the highest rate of economic growth. When Morales was first elected, 16% of the people of Bolivia were illiterate. But now UNESCO confirms that at this point Bolivia has no adult illiteracy. They've cured adult illiteracy. They also opened a huge number of hospitals. A similar situation happened in Nicaragua. You had the Sandinistas, right? They led the revolution in 1979. They led the country throughout the Civil War in the 1980s. They'd been voted out of office in 1992. Well, in 2006, they ran for office once again. They were elected, and they eventually joined Nicaragua with Bolivia and Cuba and Venezuela in what they called the Bolivarian Alternative of Latin America, or the ALBA Bank. The Sandinistas, they oversaw huge reductions in poverty. They created a state-run bank that started lending people money. They had a policy of actually enabling people to be what they called micro-entrepreneurs. That's to start their own business, but they would get a subsidy from the state. Just like in Venezuela, they had the Bolivarian circles. In Nicaragua, they have these things called citizens' power councils. The community is mobilized, they distribute food, and they've overseen an overall increase in the living standards. And actually, in 2016, the World Happiness Index of the UN said that Nicaragua had the highest rate of happiness growth of any country in the world. It was in Nicaragua. And they're also, at this point, working with China. China is pouring a lot of money into Nicaragua to build a new canal that would counter the Panama Canal. So the United States kind of sort of has control over the Panama Canal. They could block it off in some kind of military situation. Well, now China is working with the government of Nicaragua to build a canal through Nicaragua that would be an alternative to the Panama Canal. There's a pattern that plays out. There's like 4 things that happen. First, the election takes place as a referendum on neoliberalism, with communists, social democrats, and domestic capitalists unifying into a single bloc against the World Bank, the IMF, and domination by US and Western corporations. Then, a huge state apparatus is created for the purpose of stimulating the economy, with the state ultimately controlling revenue and subsidizing corporations and ultimately controlling them that way. 3, you have the creation of a mass movement in the country to support the state's agenda and carry it out on a local level. And then 4, the state overall begins setting the economic agenda for the country and planning the economy. So that's section 3 on the Bolivarian Revolution in Latin America. Go ahead.
I think the irony of that is, like, in modern day times, how we're now subsidizing American companies like Monsanto to sell grains and products to places like milk in Jamaica, where we're undercutting the local cost of those products and then cornering the market and then forcing them to buy our products and grow monocrop corn or something that they can't even live off of for biofuel or something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of
No, absolutely.
full circle.
Yeah. And it's happening domestically too. I mean, it used to be that the USA propped up its own economy by crushing the economies of people around the world. But now we're at the point these same international corporations are crushing our economy also, right? And our standard of living is dropping, right? It's kind of a global race to the bottom as a few tiny corporations reaping super profits at the expense of basically the entire human race, you know? I think it's very fascinating, and that's the period that we're living in. And what you're describing, I mean, it was done to Mexico, it was done to so many countries. I mean, you can describe in depth how it was done to Haiti, and it's a global process. But the Bolivarian Revolution used the polarization that created to build these kind of united fronts that eventually led to the creation of socialism in Latin American countries by kind of strategically aligning, just like the Bolsheviks had a series of strategic alliances with sections of the ruling class that wanted to bring down the Tsar, wanted to end the war. You know, the communists of Latin America made strategic alliances in order to fight against neoliberalism and ultimately establish socialism in 4 different countries. I think it's fascinating. Now, it's worth noting that Brazil, for example, right? Lula da Silva, he never touched property relations. He was more of a Bernie Sanders. He went in there and he had some food programs and stuff, but he never really put the state in control of the economy. And ultimately, now he's ousted, and we have Bolsonaro, in the right wing in Brazil. And there was an economic crisis in Brazil that ultimately led to the departure. And now, like, Lula da Silva is in prison, in Brazil. And there were a couple of places where you saw these kind of social democrat middle of the roaders who wouldn't touch property. They wouldn't change the nature of the economy. They were willing to expand the welfare state, but they were not willing to change the nature of the economy. And that ultimately put them in a weak position. Now, most of them have been removed from power at this point, I believe. Right? So, there you go.
Except Mexico, it's yet to be seen what's going to happen in Mexico, because it's not clear if the new president is necessarily socialist. He's definitely progressive, but I don't know if he considered himself a socialist. But it's interesting, he just won the election he became president last December, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays into this overall situation in Latin America.
And one of the most underreported things about the new president of Mexico that really boggles your mind is that Trump likes him.
Right.
Even though he's from the left, right? Because he was critical of NAFTA and all that. Trump made actually very positive comments about AMLO, in Mexico. I think that's fascinating as well. But we'll see how that plays out. He's talking about building infrastructure. But he also says that the Bolivarian, because of what's happened in Venezuela, that proves that the Bolivarian road, they need a new road. But what does that new road necessarily mean, right? I don't know. So.
I also think what you were saying about how the global system of capitalism is eventually leading to the point where it's taking the U.S. down too. It's it harkens back to what you were saying in your first section about how in order for a revolution to happen, it's essential for the ruling class to also recognize that there needs to be a change and they can't continue their way of life, because that's really what we're seeing right now in the United States, is that the ruling class of the United States is also seeing that because of the way the world economy is functioning, they can't continue to live the way that they have been living. And that's part of the reason why we're sort of ripe for revolution at this point.
All right, so my final section, I have 5 theses on the actual nature of revolution. The first thesis is that revolutionaries must present a line of march. And this is a quote from the Communist Manifesto. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes all others forward. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the mass of the proletariat the advantage of a clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. And if you look at revolutionary movements around the world, if you look at socialism in particular, there are basically 2 types of people who become socialists. On the one hand, you have what you might call a revolutionary intelligentsia. And wherever you go in the world, no matter what country it is, you have this. Students, intellectuals, young people that feel like the world that they live in is just not fair, and they want to overthrow it, and they want to overturn it, right? And they tend to be a very small minority, and they tend to be from the middle class or the upper class. They tend to be younger, some people do it their whole life, but it's more popular among younger people. And they essentially feel like the old order is unjust and corrupt, and they want to bring it down, and they want chaos, right? And it's a minority in society, and no matter where you go, no matter what the conditions are like, you find that grouping within society, right? That's the first grouping. But the second grouping is the broad masses of people, who for the most part are not interested in socialism until a crisis arises, right? And they want socialism for completely different reasons. They don't want socialism because they want chaos. They want socialism because they want order. It's capitalism is making their life chaos. They can't pay their bills. They're being forced to fight in wars. Their life is becoming unlivable. And they turn to socialism because they want order, not because they want chaos, right? And when society is stable and when the economy is good, they're not interested in socialism. They're only interested in it in a time of crisis, right? And that distinction between the revolutionary intelligentsia that always exists and the broad masses of people that generally ignore politics and socialism but get interested in it in a time of crisis needs to be clearly made. Because if you look at what Lenin did with the Party of a New Type, he took people from the revolutionary intelligentsia and he got them to operate in a way that they could organize the broad masses of people, right? And that's really what gave the power to the Bolsheviks. And if you look at it, it says revolutionaries, I'm saying revolutionaries must present a line of march. And what is a line of march? So, there's always some wise guy, if you go out and promote socialism, who says to you, what would you do if you were the president, right? And I think it is absolutely necessary for anyone who seriously believes in socialism to be able to answer that question. And to not answer that question with, oh, I don't want to be the president, I want a violent revolution. Why? Because most people don't want a violent revolution. Violent revolutions are horrific and catastrophic events in which thousands of people die, and no rational person goes around saying they want a violent revolution. And the answer can't be, oh, I would just do what some liberal would do, and then they'll say, why do I need you? I can just vote for some liberal, right? But they should always be able to answer the question. And that ultra-left adventurism that you hear from a lot of leftists, they say, oh, I want to burn it all down, I want to tear it all down. That's not proletarian, it's not working class. It satisfies a lot of people in the revolutionary intelligentsia who feel like they just want to tear it all down. But in reality, the broad masses of people have no interest in that. And actually, William Z. Foster, who's probably the greatest communist in U.S. history, very famously said, the working class and other toiling elements are always and instinctively champions of peace and democracy. This fact is so because the toilers are the ones who always have to suffer the most from the tyranny and from war's destruction. They pick up the sword against those who oppress, exploit, or would butcher them only when they have no other alternative, and only when the road of peace is closed to them, right? A lot of people think communists are people that run around screaming that they want a violent revolution. Well, no, that's a deviation. That's ultra-left adventurism. Communists are those who say they present a line of march, right? You know, if a working class person asks a socialist or a Marxist, what would you do if you were the president? They need to be able to answer the question. Now, the second thesis is the line of march that is presented must be a line of march for the entire working class. And this is about what Nick said earlier. When there is a crisis, you generally get the ruling class whipsawing the working class. Now, what's a whipsaw? That's an old tool. It's a saw that you used to cut a log with, but it had two handles on it, on the one side. And when the one guy's pushing, the other guy's pulling. When the other guy's pulling, the other guy's pushing, right? It's a whipsaw. It goes back and forth, right? And that's generally what the ruling class does when in a crisis. They find one section of the working class, and they promise to help them out if they'll help beat down and deprive another section of the ruling class. And then you get another section of the ruling class that says, okay, I'll help you if you can help us beat down and whipsaw and degrade this other section of the ruling class. And workers basically become foot soldiers for one section of the ruling class against another section of the ruling class. And Park Chung-hee, what he did in South Korea was basically, right, they had the April Revolution, conditions in South Korea, they were actually at that point poorer than North Korea was. And so the Kennedy and Johnson administrations worked with Park Chung-hee, and they went in there and they created a huge industrial urban middle class. They got Japan and other countries to loan South Korea huge amounts of money. They used the South Korean government to create a state-run steel industry, POSCO, and they raised the standard of living in urban areas in South Korea very high. But at the same time, they then exterminated huge numbers of communists. They drove the standard of living in the rural areas down. They actually built a concentration camp for orphan children. That's just a horrendous story. But because the standard of living was rising for this urban working class that was the constituency of Park Chung-hee, they backed him up. So one section of the ruling class, one section of the working class was used by the ruling class to beat the shit out of another section of the working class, right? Or you can go talk about, you know, Hitler in Germany, for example. In Germany, in the Weimar Republic, you had, you know, factory workers, industrial workers that were paid a pretty decent wage compared to the unemployed and the masses who didn't work in factories. So Hitler came in and he built his brown shirt army of desperate, poor lumpen people, and they broke the unions of the Social Democrats and of the trade unions. They broke the unions, right? They drastically reduced the conditions for the industrial workers, and then they hired a lot of these unemployed, you know, folks. And it's funny, there's a lot of talk about fascism nowadays, and I don't want to get too much into that discussion because there's a lot of disagreement about that. But ultimately, when you have one section of the working class being mobilized to attack and beat the shit out of another section of the working class in order to stave off a crisis, that can be a pretty accurate definition of fascism. When the ruling class effectively whipsaws the workers against each other, one section attacks another section, you know, and in order to counter that, revolutionaries should always be presenting a line of march that is a line of march for the entire working class, telling the entire working class, we will raise you all up out of poverty. We advance a program that will be the economic rejuvenation of the entire country to raise the standard of living of all the workers so that you don't fall into this trap of being whipsawed that ultimately leads to the crisis. So that brings me to the third thesis. Revolutionaries must go wherever people are voicing opposition to the status quo. And, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, there's another quote, and this is actually towards the end of it. He says, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social order and the political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question the property question, no matter to what degree of development it's at the time. So essentially, revolutionaries, serious revolutionaries, would break with the left-right dichotomy. For example, I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I was there, and there were loads of communists at Occupy Wall Street. They weren't particularly loved, but they were there, selling their paper, talking to people, you know? But I look back on that, and I wonder, you know, there are a lot of communists at Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street wasn't a communist movement. There were a lot of communists there. There were no communists at the Tea Party, right? And you ask the reason, why was that? Well, they say because the Tea Party was right-wing, and Occupy Wall Street was left-wing. But here's the thing. The Tea Party, what was it about? It was taxed enough already. Tea. Well, Bernie Sanders and a lot of people on the left would agree that the tax code is rigged against the working class. And that Working class people that are mad about their taxes being rigged and about the fact that they're being ripped off by the tax system should have heard from socialists about why that is, and heard that the answer is not free markets and deregulation, right? And that there's a saying that you should lower your buckets wherever the people are, not where you want them to be, right? And there's this feeling that the left can only occupy left circles, right? The only people that are recruitable to socialist politics are those on the far, far left fringe of the Democratic Party. And that's a recipe for disaster, because ultimately the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is trying to figure out a way to preserve the system, whereas those who want socialism are fighting for a new social order, right? So they should go wherever people are voicing outrage and opposition to the status quo and try to win them over to a line of march, to a socialist program. And that brings me to point number 4, is revolutionaries must oppose all forms of anti-humanism and pessimism, right? I gave a talk about ancient Rome a couple weeks back. And I talked about how in ancient Rome you had your hedonists and your stoics, right? And your hedonists were people who just lived for pleasure, right? And they went to the gladiatorial shows and they had drunken parties and they lived for pleasure. But you had some Romans who just couldn't buy into that, and they were stoics, right? And that meant that they took lots of drugs and had mystical experiences, they starved themselves, they followed philosophers that said there's more to life than wealth and money. But neither the hedonists nor the stoics could offer a way out of the Roman Empire. The problem with the Roman Empire was that it was holding back history. It was beating people down all over the world, and its entire existence was in opposition to historical progress. And the only forces that could have saved Rome were the proletariat and Julius Caesar, who had a line of march. And the line of march wasn't, we're going to tear apart the Roman Empire and have a big bloody war. The line of march was changing the way the Roman Empire related to the world and having the Roman Empire begin to engage in historical progress, right? And that there's a lot of pessimism in the world today. Climate change is real. I believe in climate change. It is 100% real. Look at the weather we've been having and how erratic it is. Climate change is a fact. However, the answer to climate change is scientific progress. We need more funding of scientific research to develop new methods of getting us off of fossil fuels and new energy sources. We need new development. The answer to the problem of climate change is not everyone just becoming poorer in order to preserve the environment, right? And I also want to say the same about cultural issues, right? That you cannot convince somebody who is opposed to abortion, you cannot have a rational conversation with them and convince them to change their opinion. That around these culture wars, this is not a rational discussion. You're arguing with people's fundamental religious and deep beliefs, cultural beliefs. You're not going to change that. But somebody who might not be able to agree with the left on a cultural issue or a gender issue might be able to overall agree with a line of march, with a vision for economically rejuvenating the country. And that if you want to actually change society, you need to be able to mobilize people with whom you disagree on issues. And I think that conversation needs to be had. And then the 5th point is revolutionaries must glorify strength and not weakness. I talked before about the fact that there are these two schools. You have your revolutionary intelligentsia that always exists, and then you have your broad masses of people, right? And among the revolutionary intelligentsia, a lot of them, the reason that they are attracted to revolutionary politics is because they don't like authority. They feel that those who are in power and have authority are oppressive and brutal, and they're outraged and opposed to such authority. And that makes sense. However, for a lot of those folks, I feel like that has morphed into a kind of pathological worship of anything they perceive as weak, right? You can take the Jussie Smollett case, right? Jussie Smollett, according to what's being alleged by the police, hoaxed a hate crime. He made himself the victim of a hate crime, right? And everyone hates him for it. No one's praising him for it. Now, Donald Trump has lied about all kinds of stuff, right? He's falsified a lot of things about himself. But he maintains a huge base of people who admire him. Why? He lies in order to make himself look stronger, not in order to make himself look like a victim. And there are working people in this country that are suffering, and that they want a way out of the crisis, and they don't want to follow someone who looks like a victim. They want to follow somebody who looks strong enough that they can lead them out of the crisis. And for a lot of people that are in this revolutionary intelligentsia, that are angered by authority, anything that reeks of strength is seen as a threat, is seen as oppressive, is seen as fascist. And so because of that, there's this opposition to anything developing on the left that would reek of strength. And that's a problem, because ultimately when people are suffering, they want to get behind somebody who looks strong enough that they could solve their problem. And that seems to be a big problem that exists in left circles. You know, people often ask why students in Youth for a New America, this youth group, why they wear suits, right? Because serious politicians wear suits, right? when working class people vote for politicians to solve their problems, they're wearing suits. You know, that you have to look at all times like you're somebody who would like to lead the country, and not someone who would like to lead the country into a violent revolution, someone who would like to lead the country out of the crisis, someone who would like to improve people's living standards and lives. And on that note, I wanted to point toward the slogan. The slogan that Students and Youth for a New America has adopted. We need a government of action to fight for working families. A government of action. Neoliberalism says the government should stay out, right? The government shouldn't do anything, hands off, laissez-faire. But socialism and the transition towards socialism in Venezuela and other countries began with a government of action coming into power. Take the opioid epidemic. A government of action would immediately declare an emergency over the opioid epidemic. It would nationalize the pharmaceutical companies and use their profits to build treatment facilities all over the country. It would provide treatment to those who suffered addiction to opioids, and it would mobilize the community to wipe out the scourge of heroin addiction. A government of action here in New York City would immediately impose a tax on landlords for having empty housing units, and as a result drive the price of rent to affordable levels. They would also restrict real estate sales in order to halt the speculation market that has been driving the price of real estate and rent higher. A government of action would declare that houses are for living in, not for bankers and landlords to make profits, and would force the market to adjust based on this understanding. A government of action would immediately renationalize the subway system and take it out of the hands of the Public Beneficent Corporation, the MTA, that's been ripping off the public. A government of action would hire the China Railway Corporation, the state-run train company that makes the fastest trains in the entire world, to rebuild the public transportation system. A government of action would not bail out banks, it would seize them. It would put lending and the distribution of credit into the hands of the community and allow the community to determine how money should be spent, what corporations should receive a subsidy based on what they can do for the community, right? A government of action would stop allowing big corporations to rake in super profits from oil and gas and the coal, right? Instead, it would declare that the oil, the gas, the coal, and the timber of the United States, it's the property of everyone who lives in this country, and the profits from it should go to build more universities and more high-speed railway and for the overall development of the country. A government of action would stop spending billions of dollars to maintain hundreds of overseas military bases, occupying and drone striking people around the world. A government of action would utilize the money being spent on the military, and more importantly, the human beings in the military who actually want to serve the country, and would use them to rebuild the country, fix up the crumbling highways, the water systems, and the power plants. Any communist who cannot give an answer to what would you do if you were the president is in complete dereliction of duty. And I wanted to just end with the point, there's a very famous writer named Thomas Carlyle, not a Marxist, not a socialist, but he's a well-known historian, a sociologist. And in his writing, he talks about how a lot of the great prophets of ancient times, like Jeremiah and Zarathustra and Muhammad, a lot of the times they would emphasize the end to idolatry, or the worship of idols, right? And he talks about what does this actually mean, this worship of idols, right? Because the people in ancient times, they weren't stupid. They didn't literally believe they could just carve some piece of wood or piece of stone and that would be God, right? That when these idols or fetishes were erected, when they were erected, people associated them with higher principles and higher ideals. And when these prophets came along, like Jeremiah or Muhammad or Zarathustra, came along and urged the people to stop worshiping idols, what they were saying was that they should stop being routine, right? They should stop worshiping this piece of wood and actually start believing in the principles and the passions that this piece of wood, this piece of stone once stood for. Carlyle talks about how the prophets are those who come to restore passion and meaning and truth to the earth when things have become routine and dull and unquestioned, right? Well, I feel very much like Marxism in the United States has become a land of idols. You've got a lot of forces who bow before their little picture of Rosa Luxemburg or Trotsky or their holy leader from the 20th century and go about living a routine. And I hope that everyone in this room can become a kind of 21st century prophet of Marxism, and that you can encourage people to cast away their idols and instead return to the principles and the passions and the truths that once built the socialist movement and once led to the transformation of whole societies. And on that note, I am finished. And that a lot of times these things get confused, and that one of the things that neoliberalism has done is said that socialism is when the government does stuff. right? So if the government does anything, it's socialist. The post office is socialist, right? You know, McDonald's is capitalist, the post office is socialist. This is silly. Every capitalist society in history has had some level of public, you know, roads, for example, right? The roads aren't built around here because New York City is a socialist country. They're just the socialist communist government built all these roads, the government's doing stuff. They were built because all these buildings are owned by capitalists who really need people to be able to drive to these buildings. You know what I mean? And the post office is in the Constitution. It's actually in the Constitution that the US federal government will maintain a post office. For a long time they didn't even legalize FedEx and other things. They protected the monopoly of the post office much more aggressively. Because in order to have a capitalist market, you needed to have, you know, a post office that wasn't loyal to any private entity, that the state would oversee, so every business got equal treatment when it came to the post office so that everyone could send things through the mail. It's only in the 70s and 80s with the rise of neoliberalism, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, Ayn Rand, it's only with the rise of those folks that all of a sudden this notion that we don't need a public sector has been raised. Private prisons. If you went back to people in the 1920s and said, hey, why don't we pay private companies to set up prisons? And then they'll have an incentive for the more people that get locked up, then they'll make money. What could go wrong with that, right? People would have looked at you like you're a nut. People would have said, are you insane? They'll be locking people up like crazy because they want to make money. Well, that all changed with the rise of neoliberalism and Milton Friedman. You know, military contractors, private companies that make money from war, right? Instead of having the military do it out of the public budget, we have private companies that get paid our tax dollars in order to go fight wars around the world. What could go wrong with that? Well, I can think of a lot. There's an incentive, you know, and that this is neoliberalism, and this is a different form of capitalism. There's welfare capitalism, you know, that we saw across Europe, and the Keynesian consensus that came after the Second World War, where you had, these were capitalist countries, but they had huge state sectors, like in Norway and Sweden and France, where you had almost full employment because the government, anyone who was unemployed, they'd hire you to be an artist, and you just paint a picture in your house, and they'd give you a check. You know, that kind of thing happened, but that wasn't overturning capitalism. That was an effort to maintain capitalism, the state intervention. And that's why I urge people to avoid the phrase redistribution of wealth. Because redistribution of wealth happens under any system. Any system has redistributed wealth. The roads outside this building are built with wealth that was redistributed from the tax dollars of people like you and me, right? We paid our taxes, they then built the roads, right? And some countries redistribute huge amounts of wealth. Some countries do it very small. In some cases, we redistribute wealth to the rich, right? We give corporate subsidies and bailouts to banks and such. In some cases, we redistribute wealth to low-income folks, like food stamps. But food stamps, let's be real, also benefits agribusiness and the farmers, right? It enables, it's a subsidy of American agriculture, but it also helps low-income people get food. Redistribution of wealth happens under every system. Every system has redistribution of wealth. Socialism is not the redistribution of wealth. Socialism is a new economic system in which the state plans and controls the economy in order to ensure that economic growth continues. And that distinction needs to be made, because I feel like, and that's the weird thing about the Bernie Sanders movement, is it's like for so long, the average advocates of neoliberalism have said, what, you want to see a doctor when you're sick? We can't do that. That's socialism. Oh, what, you want a free education? You can't do that. That's socialism. So you've got a whole generation of young people who are right, all right, fine, I'm a socialist, right? I'm a socialist. You got me. You know, that's basically what's going on here, is we're renegotiating neoliberalism. But I think we should be having a conversation about the fact that our economy operates to serve profits, not public good. And that's what Eugene Debs and socialism and Marxism was all about from the beginning. So do we want to conclude on that? All right. Thank you very much. It was fun. Be sure to give us your email before you go. Thanks.